Hello and welcome to The Map. Today we confront a series of questions that strike at the heart of faith, culture, and the human spirit. Tim and I wrestle with the growing tension between individualism and community, tracing its effects from the ancient traditions of Eastern Orthodoxy to the sprawling corporate-like structures of the modern-day megachurch. In a world that prizes autonomy and consumption above covenant and responsibility, the church faces a grave challenge to remain rooted in the eternal truth while navigating a culture that cheapens the sacred into a spectacle. Industrialization hasn't just changed how we work, it's changed how we worship, how we think, and how we sense belonging. This conversation moves beyond a critique. It calls us to remember that life is not an entitlement, but a gift, given with the expectation of stewardship. And suffering is not some detour from the path, but a forge where character and faith are refined on the path. And family and friendship, true sacrificial, covenantal family and friendship, cannot be bought, it cannot be optimized, and it must not be commodified. If the church is going to endure, which it will, spoiler alert, it must resist the temptation to measure success by numbers alone, and instead rebuild the bonds of community with courage, humility, and love. The future of faith depends not on adapting to culture, but on standing firm against its most corrosive tendencies. You're invited in this conversation that demands some thought, demands a little bit of honesty, and it's going to demand much of you if you're going to act out on it, as all worthwhile things do. Again, welcome my friend Tim Churchward to The Map.
0, all engine running. Liftoff.
Yeah, well, I don't know if the moderator's just gonna be like a wallflower and sitting there and pushing us along and reeling us in. But anyway, so we're talking about Eastern Orthodoxy and priesthood, and talking about how the idea of individualism and an individual can just kind of speak out into the ethos and the traditions, and as well as mysticism, and how that's really a fairly new thing. And you said, I'm getting ready to go on a tirade, so I threw the recording on. So fire away.
The thing with Eastern Orthodoxy is that it's all about community. So Eastern way of thinking is not about the individual as a unit, as someone who has individual thoughts. I mean, they don't deny that clearly, but there is this sense in which we are a community of people and we create the body of Christ if we are in Christ. And so we are his body, we are subsumed into that. It's why transubstantiation is so important for Orthodox and Catholicism anyway. But I think there's just a really interesting narrative in terms of the Protestant evangelical vision of the individual with their right to their opinion. Normally I was thinking about this today, whenever I hear someone say, I've got my right to my own opinion, I'm like, yeah, you do, but your opinion's stupid, so you probably shouldn't have it, or at least think about it differently. It's just for me, it's just a really bizarre thing that we have this individual right to an opinion, even though we have absolutely no grid as an individual for why we think the way we think or how we think the way we think. But not even just that, we feel entitled that what we think must at least be right for us and therefore carry some element of truth, which also is complete rubbish. So anyway, the individual part of it is just a bit of a bizarre thing for me. And coming from a Protestant background, studying Eastern Orthodoxy in some pretty significant depth for this PhD that I'm doing, I do see some of the points that they make. But what I really want to talk about, outside of that a little bit, was this idea of the individual becoming a commodity, the person, the human becoming a commodity in the nature of Protestantism, evangelicalism, Pentecostalism, charismania, whatever we want to call it, and particularly in the Western modern understanding of the church on the basis and as with a foundation of industrialization as a root of that. So there's this guy called Paul Tillich. I think he died in the 70s or 80s. He wrote in the 60s and 70s, full theologian. He wrote an amazing little book, tiny little book. If you're interested, it's called The Theology theology of culture, Paul Tillich. He was a German who exited in Nazi regime from Germany and was settled in America, and it spoke a lot about this idea of the original philosophy being theology, and if that is true, then there has to be a theological reason for culture. And orthodoxy would really suggest that every single individual person, as part of a community, creates something cultically, as in within the context of how they create culture around them, that is divine, because they're made in the image of God. So this idea that we are creating constantly culture around us that is in some way divine is a real aspect of orthodox thinking, because then instead of Christianity being combative and trying to kill the things that are wrong, it reorientates, or Americans say reorients, the things that are wrong thinking into right thinking. So, for example, that's why the original Christianity, particularly within the context of the Roman Empire, but Orthodox Christianity, would have been about taking pagan festivals, partnering in terms of the celebration, but twisting the meaning towards Christ. So that's reorientating the nature of the individual culture that is created through whatever the image of that people group was, the image of Christ that they held, the image of God that they held, and then reorientate it back into the holiness of God himself. So it's just really fascinating to me. But on that basis, one of the things that we see a lot in our culture is that the church, we see this a lot in mega churches, but the church in general is responding to Western culture in the way that Western culture has defined itself. So instead of the church being countercultural, in my experience, church capital C, we are actually being molded by culture. So what I mean by that is that if we look at how the industrialization process has begun since the mid-1700s or mid to late 1700s through into the 1800s through into the 1900s, what's happened is that we've seen this incredible shift away from local small communities, family-orientated community and family-orientated parish churches which look after the needs of the people, to this mass migration from country and community into inner cities and the creation of basically huge cities. And what happens is that you go to the city because you get paid more than the country. This is very crude, but I'm just giving you like the basics. You get paid more than you would in the countryside because that is the promise of what it means if you sell your soul to a business. So, for example, you go into the steel mills, or the paper mills, or you go into the mines in Wales, or whatever the community aspect of that pre-industrialization. Although industrialization took it over, there's much more community there. But what you have as you go into like the printing presses and all of these things that happen in the cities, you have the commoditization of the individual being, I am a person and I have time and I have energy and capacity, and I will sell my soul, sell my life to earn more money and get a better life on the basis of financial remuneration. Although never in health, by the way, in cities. The smog's killed most people over the course of their lives. So ironically, you sold your soul for the financial benefit for your family, but killed them in the process physically. And I mean, that's a really, really powerful symbol of what goes on in Western culture. You sell your soul for the immediate gratification of what you think is better, but in the long term, you actually minimize the foundational narrative of your family life. It's why covenant, God is a God of covenant, is a God who wants sacrifice and does himself sacrifice in the moment, in the present, in order to preserve and protect and then promote the future, on the future of humanity. Anyway, so then we have this really interesting narrative that industrialization becomes, you are the commodity as a human being, but it's worth it for you because you consume the thing that you produce. So the thing that you produce creates wealth, creates money, mainly for the top dude, but actually for you as well, because he'll pay you for your time in a way that is far greater than what you've ever received farming. But what's absolutely foundational, at least to me, is that then what happens is that the individual, as they become a commodity, they actually sell their soul for the product that industrialized business brings to them. And so then if you look at the church, the modern day church, what we do is we follow that model. This is my view. I'm not saying I'm completely right. This is not every church. I'm talking to you about my experience of church in general in the West. And so what happens is that we tend to follow that model. So we say to people, come in to us. We're not coming to you. We're going to create something, going to create a business model or a brand or whatever it is. Come into the church and give us your time and your money. give us your time and your money, and which effectively commoditizes the individual. Now, it's never meant to be that, and no pastor's going, I'm commoditizing all of my people. That's not what they think. But what that's basically, it's following the same structure of the Industrial Revolution. And then what happens is that you then continue to create a better and better and better product that validates these individuals giving all of their time and a lot of their money to it. Am I making any sense? So we follow this really interesting dynamic of the Industrial Revolution, where we invite people into a city centre, into the hub of what it is that the product is going to be, how we're going to produce. They're coming in as individual people who are willingly laying down their money and their time, which isn't necessarily a problem. I'm just highlighting some stuff. And then the product begins, the brand begins to get better and better and better, and the thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds are spent on technological equipment or paying the pastor or private jets or whatever it might be, right? And we end up having the CEO of businesses or the founders of those businesses, of those churches, becoming incredibly wealthy, or at least incredibly well known, and obviously within that context generous and philanthropic, of course. But there is also this sense in which we have the church becoming the model of a business. And I wonder whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, really, because the commoditization of the individual foundationally represents the church taking on the structure of the society as opposed to being the countercultural narrative to it. Anyway, I said quite a lot there. I don't know if you've got anything to say about that.
Yeah. Have you ever seen the show The Righteous Gemstones? You ever heard about this show?
Is it American?
Yeah, it's so I had a buddy of mine who he knows like kind of my background. He's like, you ever see The Righteous Gemstones? I'm like, no, I don't know what that is. And then I like got on YouTube and watched a couple of clips of it. And I'm like, yeah, probably not gonna watch the show. But it's Danny McBride. He can be pretty funny, but it's Danny McBride. John Goodman's in it. There's like several comedians in it, but it's basically making fun of megachurch, like televangelist kind of personalities. So you watch it. I mean, they're not doing it to intentionally, I think, like make fun of like Jesus or like the ecclesia or like anything like that. But they really are just thumbing their nose hard on these people who scam people out of their money. Like the one guy, I'm sure you've seen a clip. I'm sure you've seen clips of it, but he's just like, people ask me, how much money did you make from this water here? He's like, after I pay my scientists and these people and these people and these people, not a dime. And I do it all to make the world a better place. But he's like, I don't know, just like the scammiest of the scammiest for like these televangelists, like megachurch kind of pastors. But no, I think it's an interesting parallel to pull. Like you were talking about people leaving, like what you're giving up to live like a life in the countryside. You're with your family, you're living intergenerationally, you're out in the sunshine, you got clean air, you have purpose, but like economically, like your GDP is going to look like this forever, but you have
passive rights for your children to become adults, all that stuff. That's all lost in industrialization. Yeah.
And so you trade that off to go to the city, and like, you know, we're already like people are really strong. I have to strongly question, like, do I like, because the concept of the kingdom is family ultimately, and what do people say when they start coming into money and they move to a city is like, can we afford to have another kid? Because you have taken like costs to get that kid to school or healthcare and food, and like your expenses will go up. And I did like the math once, like on diapers, like disposable diapers, depending on like the length of time that you have your kid on average. I thought it was something between, the math I did was $5,000 to $8,000 on diapers, and that's when I was living in Germany, where the prices might be a little bit cheaper than in the States. But yeah, you're looking at $5,000 to $8,000 per kid per diapers, dude. 10
pay money, get the product.
Yeah. So yeah, it's an interesting thought. I mean, like, when did you see, like, from your perspective, I guess like America and Europe, there's always going to be a little bit different, but like from your perspective, when do you see this model becoming like more popular and kind of taking traction in Europe, of like kind of branded, like business structured kind of church hierarchy, that kind of stuff?
For me, it's Hillsong coming to the UK or coming to Europe. That's the first time I saw it. And here, so what I want to be clear is that I'm not criticising this. I'm just trying to ask some questions. So I think like when I saw Hillsong come, and when I saw because we saw parts of it, like I don't know if you've ever heard of Delirious or like they're
This is there's the happy song.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
and all the rest of them. But I mean, like we saw music really take this on, right? So we saw the popularity of music particularly begin to really impact the church. So we saw like and so we saw like Delirious get to the top 20 with this song called Deeper in like I don't know like 1990 something, you know. So I think that was this really interesting dynamic, and then the church really got on the back of this. Let's do music well. So Vineyard did that powerfully. Vineyard in the UK is the highest grossing album, Christian album of all time, I'm pretty sure, has come Now Is the Time to Worship. And actually the guys that I go to church with, the guys that lead that church, they were the ones who found the girl who wrote some of those songs on the album. And so then it became about music, and it became about the product very, very quickly. Because what people realised was, this is my observation, this is anecdotal, right? This isn't me saying I've done some massive research to this is what I've seen. I was born in '86, and I've sort of watched the trajectory. And out of the house church movement, which was the 70s and 80s, the charismatic renewal house church movement, what happened is that those churches freaking exploded, bro. They exploded. They were absolutely like massive, and they all started buying buildings or got given buildings because the wealthy people started joining them, all that stuff. And then what happened is that they had to figure out, how do we do corporate worship well? So the electric guitars start coming in, the drums start coming in, all that sort of stuff, and then the music and the way that we worship and how we worship communally and corporately became a really important aspect of it, as it always has been, but in a very modern way. And then Hillsong came, and Hillsong United, and maybe Jesus Culture just slightly afterwards, and there was this rocket boom. It's like, so Australia and America both represented there, and there were people before there, like Gateway were doing stuff, like they were doing all those different bits and pieces. And obviously Bethel came off the back of that, Bethel Music, and they got the Elevation worship guys, you've got the Upper Room worship guys, you've got like all of these people. And if you have the right amount of technology, the right amount of money, the right amount of expertise and gift and all that sort of stuff, you can create a product that everybody wants. And music really was the beginning point of this, at least in my living memory, which was where we would invest our money, our time in a product that would, yes, draw people to God, draw people into encounter with Him, normally emotionally. So what you'd find with particularly music-orientated or worship-orientated churches, there's a high level of emotional engagement, which draws people in. It switches lots of people off, so they would never touch it with a barge pole, particularly men, actually. Like, it draws people in. And then what happens is what you'll notice is that the pastors, when they minister or when they preach or whatever else it is, it's quite polemic, and it's also quite emotionally driven. So they get people forward, or they pray for people that need healing, or none of it's a bad thing. I'm just saying, like, you have the heightened emotion of awareness of God in terms of the music, then you have the product of the music, and then you have people drawn into an emotional encounter with God more than anything else in my experience in these sorts of churches. So I think that's the trajectory that I saw, or that I've seen. And I mean, the Orthodox Church absolutely hate the charismatic expression of they see it as propaganda. So the Orthodox Church would look at the charismatic renewal churches in like 2020s onwards, or 2010s or whatever, and they'd be like, this is emotional propaganda. That's what they'd say. They'd be like, you're stirring up something in an individual to draw them into an encounter or draw them into something which is an emotional stirring and actually isn't really real. Anyway, that aside, that's when you come and you say, okay, I feel so good in this church. I feel like so amazing here, not because of the community or because of the local aspect of it or because there's families or whatever, but because the product that I receive. And then churches started taking their kids out. So churches start taking the kids out of the environment of the main service and creating a kids' church. And again, there's not a problem. I'm just saying this is the trajectory. And so what happens is that the family-orientated church kind of dies a death, unless like you do like a picnic once a year in the summer or whatever. But what happens is that the kids go out and do the kids' church, which they love, by the way. This is what our church does. They love it. The adults don't have the kids screaming, and if the kid does scream, you better get out in 15 seconds. Even if everyone says, it's not but you better get out because you're,
Yeah.
in the words of Benny Hinn, take that baby out before the anointing leaves, And so I think that there's this really interesting dynamic journey there, which is now we have people who are buying into a product, primarily worship music, which is great. I actually really enjoy that music. I mean, I buy into that product. I'm part of what I'm talking about. And then you have the fracture of family in the context of the church. And then you have this very interesting dynamic where then you get spectators, you get people that come for them, and you also get people who are nominal Christians who come to the church with the best music. And we see this really interesting dynamic happen, and it's an exact representation of Western culture. That's what it's a response to Western culture.
Yeah, so there's a few different things to unpack there. I mean, like before we like jumped on and hit the recording, I mean, just to like kind of frame this a little bit, how we're going to unpack what you just said, is we talked a little bit about how like there's different structures of government that you could follow. And we talked about you could have tyranny, you could have democracy, you could have an oligarchy, a timocracy, or aristocracy. And you could do the same thing in church. You kind of see these waves and movements of like what you're talking about, of like when you come out of and Europe has experienced this for a long period of time as well as America. Like America, we've had like strong Protestant roots like through, but so like kind of what you experience with like the good priest in the middle of the town is running the town. Europe is built in semicircles around the spire, and people want to look up because they're looking for God, and the good priest is there to be the oracle to kind of lead us. And so it's almost the equivalency of what we've seen in the 70s and 80s in America in the shepherding movement, which it was a very like driven to like, how to say, it emphasized like submission and accountability and discipleship, basically, is what it was like kind of emphasizing. But what it like made space for was, and you could have like strong bonds there, but it's like just cult, basically. It's tyranny. Like it's like the bottom of that like rung of what like we argued of Aristotle or Plato, who's famous. But like and then that gave way to churches like what you're describing, of they try to make like what's called seeker friendly churches. There's people who have been kind of like burnt by that, and so now they're trying to make it more attractive, which is more like democracy, kind of shaped by the appetite of people and not like necessarily a specific denomination. So we have a rise of non-denominational churches, where you were saying before is like we have to come in and kind of wrestle with truth and shape how we're going to interpret scriptures. And then it just came more about like we want church to kind of feel good there. And that, you know,
we want church to be for the new person coming in specifically to engage in a way that is real for them, even if it's not deep or even true.
Yeah, so you're trading. So instead of going narrow and deep, you're going broad and shallow. And within that shallowness, you're watering down things to accommodate, I say like on church people, but people who have no background in faith, to like make them feel normal. And you'll start watering down Jesus himself. And so one of the results of that is you can get some cultural relevance, because now you're getting numbers. So now you can kind of shape culture in a town a little bit. And people could make the argument, like I remember I had a Haitian friend once, and he just said, this is way back in the day, but he was talking about Joel Osteen. He's like, every single message, the guy gives an invitation for people to give their life to Jesus. Jesus is responsible for these people. Like the guy, maybe he's greedy, maybe he does it for whatever, but his perspective was kind of in line with that, like numbers, like that's where like impact is being made, of like getting in front of as many people that can hear. And that kind of created the, yep.
That's better.
Okay, so that saying all that to say, like, so that's more of like a democracy thing of like being led by the masses, letting the masses kind of drive it. And then that set the platform for what you're talking about, which is more of an oligarchy, where now people take note, and now I can make a brand. Now I can brand the type of like church that we're going to be and market that and create an economical engine out of that, and then commoditize people to build this thing. And you have to come under the brand, and now you're giving your time, your energy, your resources, and in the same way that you traded off your time and energy and resources to leave mom and dad at the farm where they could watch your kids and you could live intergenerationally, you're trading that to give as much time as you can to build this thing that you really don't have any real stake in, like you do with your family, because if you die, your family's gonna come. If you like, I don't know, like you're in the same way you went into the factory. The branded institutional Christianity can be in that way a factory. So the impact there is, again, you're having more cultural influence. You're creating infrastructure, and what I witnessed or what I saw was that there are certain people who have like this concept of the seven mountains of society, seven fears of society. Now the oligarchy of the mountain of religion, so to speak, and their own teaching was, it's our job now to influence culture, to shape culture, again, for the brand, the mini kingdom inside the kingdom. And so now politically or family or education or economics or whatever. And so this kind of gave rise to, like, and I've seen people do this, like they were a worship leader and now all of a sudden they're a social media influencer selling business courses online. So they've kind of leveraged the vehicle of a brand to go influence another sphere of society. So I'm not saying good or bad or whatever, because I don't know the motives of people. But again, like in this model, we have abandoned completely like that family actually is the core value. That when Jesus is being baptized and a voice comes from heaven, it didn't say, "This is my new CEO. This is God could have said anything. I joke sometimes. He could have said, "This is Gilgamesh. This is Chewbacca. This is whatever." But he said, "This is my son." So it's a declaration of like the invisible God, the creator of the universe, the master of the universe, is saying that he can have a relationship with humans like that this is going to be my son in whom I'm well pleased. And so it was a revolution of like, okay, Jesus is coming to reveal the invisible God, reveal that kingdom, that authority, that structure, that system. And that system starts off the basis of family. And when you lose the concept of family, then you're abandoning and sacrificing and prioritizing something else. And so when something else then starts competing with the priority, then I can get a little bit more pointed with my speech of like, well, what are you doing? And I can speak to like, in America, to your point, like Francis Chan said this, like if you have people, like-minded people, good music, good speaker, and with money, you can build a big church. You don't need God to do that. And when I was in Europe for 8 years, I saw people trying to copy and paste stuff. The issue is they don't have as much money. They can't do it, Americans.
And also, like in Europe, we have a far higher level of cynicism when it comes to emotional engagement with things. So
yeah.
So one of the big things about the growth of the church in the UK is that it's fundamentally Pentecostal, particularly Black African Pentecostal growth. That's where the majority growth is, right? It's not among white Europeans. It's not. Some, of course. Do you know where most of the white Europeans are going? Orthodoxy. Because there's this really interesting narrative where people want to know the truth. They, particularly men are desperate for truth. They're not really that bothered about putting their hands in the air, jumping around. Some are. I love that. I mean, I love that. There's no issue. Like, I like flopping around like a fish every now and again. But actually, for most men, they're like, tell me the truth and I'll live by the truth. This is the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. On the flip side, it is the Andrew Tate phenomenon. Andrew Tate obviously is an awful character, but as a sociological phenomenon, we have to understand his place in the cultural conversation, because he is basically saying this is what men are, and men are like, oh great, I didn't realise I could be that. I can be really strong and really masculine and really powerful and all that jazz. Anyway, I'm going to go off on a tirade about that. But actually, there's something about the family piece that's really important there. Because if the greatest sexual revolution that ever happened was the 1st century AD, which was the early church basically monogamizing sex, which is the only cultural phenomenon there where that has ever happened, where women are elevated to a place of societal standing where they do not have to be put up with being sex slaves or whatever. That, by the way, that sexual revolution is reversed in the 1960s with the advent of reliable contraception, but also with this idea of free love and have sex like a man. That was the 60s and 70s, which men hadn't been having sex like men for at least a millennia. So there's this really interesting dynamic there, because what it meant is that men stayed in families. So instead of the greatest phenomenon, Tom Holland talks a lot about this actually, but the greatest phenomenon in Christian history is that men were convinced to stay in their family. They don't get pregnant, they have to carry a baby, they don't give birth to a baby, they don't have to feed the baby. The mother is absolutely pivotal for that baby's generation and health, right? Men have nothing, they need to have nothing to do with the baby. Now, we know that's negative. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but I'm saying
it's pragmatic, yeah.
Exactly. There's no physical binding of me saying, because I could walk out and go, oh, suck it, I'm done. But Jess couldn't do that. She's still breastfeeding. So actually, there's something really powerful there to acknowledge that men staying in the family home is a God-given design. So family, man, woman, kids, is a God design. And actually, not only is it a God design, it is the greatest transformation of Western culture that has ever happened in history, of any culture, I think, that's happened in history. And so when you lose the family orientation of church, we get a problem. Sorry, Karen.
Yeah, and I think that you just, like, I was holding on to that thread from way back, because we do this thing where we'll follow, then rabbit trail, then rabbit trail. So I was holding on to the thread, but that's what you said way back in the beginning about the individual, the hyperfixation on the individual, and how on both sides. So it's like, it's a total fallacy of like, hey, we want to liberate you. And like, there's all these memes about it, like women, like, don't stay home and make babies and be a slave to that guy. Go and work for some guy who you don't have a real relationship with, and he'll give you a salary, but you have to like make enough money to pay to go to work, the whole deal.
And but you have to put your kids into 24-hour childcare where a 19-year-old raises your daughter.
Yeah, give me $1,500 a month and I'll wipe your kid's nose, maybe, and send them home with the flu. You can only use me for half the month.
That is too.
I'll take full pay. Yeah, dude. But the hyperfixation on the individual and the end of, like, this is a very Western kind of like thing of like not looking at the qualitative piece of being part of a collective and holding that intention with your individualism. But when you hyper express on the individualism, the woman doesn't know her place in the family, the man doesn't know his place in the family, the kids don't know their place in the family. And so when you start pulling those fabrics apart and like the roles stay pulled apart, then you see a disintegration of every institution that they're a part of. And I have to like believe that it's just like, you don't have to have a brain between your ears. Like, everybody knows this, that we're all being engineered, that we're all being influenced by something. So for some people, it's the Illuminati. Some people, it's like snake people. Some people, it's aliens. And some people, it's like, hey, there are spiritual forces at work that are working in these different institutions for the good and the bad. And so we're aware that, okay, you just make an observation. Was this good or was this bad? Or was it a benefit? Was it a net benefit, a net positive? Or what is this producing? And I think that feeding into the idea that freedom looks like, and then you kind of went into like, even with church, of like, it's feeding into like just what's feeling good for me in the moment, or what validates me in the moment. And you said this in the very beginning, like, yeah, I have the freedom to make my own thoughts and my own ideas and whatever. It's like, yeah, but you're stupid, because every single idea that you've had, there's been somebody in the collective of the human history who's had that idea. They had the same problem that you had, and there's people who didn't figure it out, but there's people who have figured it out. And then there's people who thought, anyways, that there has to become some kind of acceptance or orientation to, my life didn't start with me. Like, you have to accept that. So it's my parents, okay, but who created them? Who created them? So you follow the bouncing ball of karaoke all the way back to, there's a creator of everything that exists, and so therefore everything is a gift. And if everything's a gift, then I'm just being given something that I'm going to be able to steward, but I can't take full, complete ownership over something that's gifted to me because I wasn't able to manufacture it myself. And so when we talk about people, just to finish the thought, yeah, there's no entitlement to my own life, to the status of my health, to the status of my finances, and by default, the children that I'm responsible for. So in the English language, you'd say my wife, my children, my mom, my dad. That denotes ownership, depending on how you think about it. But I just have responsibility to those people, and if God forbid something happens to whoever or myself, where I get a chronic disease or something happens, I could be pissed off and butthurt about it, and rightfully so. Like, I'm going to be upset because I don't have the same quality of life or access to somebody who I had before. But I was gifted that, so I can also say, well, I'm thankful for the amount of time that I had here with this. And so, but people feel there's this weird thing, and this feeds into the consumerism thing, that every single year everything should improve, that everything in life should just be like this. Companies think like this. I've worked in sales before, and it's like, well, Tim, we know that you worked an 80-hour week and you've just shattered every company record that we've ever had before, and now we just have this massive growth. For next quarter, we expect you to double that. Here's a pizza for your troubles. It's like a weird thing, and like people expect that the new iPhone has to have this, and new that has this, and they expect that for their own life, and life doesn't look like that. Life is like twists and turns, and sometimes you have to hold on for dear life, sometimes you have to let go for dear life, and ingrained in this like branded Christianity thing is somehow like, hey, let me be your guru, let me be your self-help coach, let me take away your bad feelings and give you good feelings, let me help you transcend yourself financially, let's get rid of the sickness that's in you. And like, we've seen people get healed. We've seen miracles, but I've also seen people who have chronic diseases where they literally want to commit suicide every day sometimes. And it's like, it's an ongoing dialogue with God, but then they just accept, this is my ministry to the Lord, is living in this. That is not attractive. That is not something that you can market and package to the masses. Like, I had a podcast with the guy who mentored me, and he was just on a lady with this lady on the phone all the time, this lady named Ginger. He's like, I didn't know what to say. This lady like suffered with scoliosis and autoimmune diseases. And she'd call him. She's like, I had another argument with God, Jim. He's like, who won, Ginger? He did. He's good. But he was like, every time he talks about it, he's told me about it 3 times. It left such a mark on him. The just gratitude and thanksgiving this woman had in the midst of absolute suffering. If you have chronic pain in your body, if anybody listen to this, you would understand what I'm saying about. And for her just to have gratitude. And so I think that in the midst of this like, okay, commoditization of church, and like elitism rises up, and like the same thing with sales of like productivity and numbers and all that stuff. What's left behind is family. What's also left behind is there is no space for God in the failure. There's no space for God in the lack of finances. There's no space for God in the pain. If it's not solved, if we can't like fix it, it's like there's a measure of people. There's just an inevitability. There's going to be people who are going to be broken and walk with a limp, and restoration doesn't look like the limp being taken away. Restoration looks like what happens actually to the inner man, not the emotions, the inner man, like the whole man. And so you look at somebody like Jacob, or you look at somebody like Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth just dropped down the stairs, and he's just a crippled his whole life, and he has a place at the king's table because of who his dad is, but he's still crippled. Jacob wrestled with God. One of the greatest, I'm going off a tangent, but one of the greatest stories in the Bible is like everybody else has a divine like experience. They see an angel, they see something, they're like, oh my God, please don't kill me. The angel has to say, don't be afraid. This dude says, hold my beer, I'm going to wrestle that thing and hold on until it gives me something. But he's crippled the rest of his life as a result of it. He walks differently there. And I think like that
it's the foundational narrative of the sacrifice of the moment for the covenant of the future. Jacob wrestling with God is an exact symbolic representation of the idea that you sacrifice your immediate comfort in order to receive the blessing for your future family. So this is such a foundational narrative of the biblical text. It's like the nature of covenant is not a bargain. It's not when you say, I'll give you this and you give me this, which is the prosperity gospel at its core. Actually, what covenant is a familial covenant that says, I am willing to sacrifice the immediate moment, my money, my time, the immediacy of my comfort, in order that I can provide for my family in the future. And so I think if you go back to family, and if we go back to the lady, Ginger, you're talking about, you go back to God, you can't commoditize any of those people. So what you do is you love them and you pray for them, and that's absolutely amazing, but you can't commoditize family. Because family is incredibly complex. You can't just say, hey, you guys serve on this team. You know, like, it doesn't work like that. You also can't commoditize God. You can't put him in a box. And so what often happens in Western churches is that we say to God, hey, God, you do whatever you want in the context of what we're doing. And in that context, we're like, it's really good sometimes. It's amazing. But what we're saying to God is we're saying, hey, you can do whatever you want as long as it fits in the context of our branding, which is what we're going after, which is what you've told us to go after, God. So because you've told us to go after this, then we're going after this so you can come and do what you've told us to do. But outside of that, actually, it would really help us if you weren't quite God in that moment, because we can do this pretty well. And no matter how much we have these conversations about what's God saying, what's the Lord saying, whatever else it is, I know hardly any prophets in churches because we're not good at family. So basically in the larger churches that I've been involved in and also know about, the person that hears from God. Now, I want to say something that I don't think Bethel does this, and I've got a lot of time for Bethel around how they run the fivefold ministry. But a lot of the churches we've been involved in, the person that hears from God is a senior pastor. But what that is a CEO. So if the senior pastor speaks to God, if the God speaks to the senior pastor, who is essentially running the organisation, there's no actual prophetic input apart from the thing that the senior pastor feels the thing is to go after. And so what happens is that you have all these prophetic alliances that pop up all over the show outside of church, because senior pastors don't really want the family aspect of the fivefold ministry. They don't really want that, because what they want to do is they want to do what they think God has called them to do. And what's really interesting is that the senior pastor will create, in my experience, will create the church around his call or her call, not around what God is saying about the church. And so the church becomes synonymous with the call of the pastor, as opposed to synonymous with the fivefold gifting, which is actually the equivalent of family within the context of leadership of church.
Yeah, well, it has to be like that in some ways, because like you have somebody in an impossible position where, again, like you're talking about, we need you to have the organization, administrative skills of like a CEO. We need you to be a very charismatic speaker. We need you to be on the level of a professional counselor. We need you also to be like an event organizer. We need you also to be, and these things are being stacked on each other, not shifted, stacked on top of each other. And so by default, if I'm more of a teacher, then that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to teach you. I'm going to like truth more than people, and I'm going to hyperfixate on like having the right theology, having the right doctrine. If I'm an evangelist, I'm going to use every single opportunity and event, everything that I'm going to preach the gospel. I'm going to activate people to go out and preach the gospel, and like that's what I'm going to do. If I'm a pastor, then I'm going to be hyperfixated on how can I make Tim comfortable? How can I make sure families are whole? How can I make sure people are not divorces? But also I don't want to step on anybody's toes. So when you throw like somebody who's prophetic in there, it's like we're going to go this direction. Maybe it's that it would not be like this thing of growth that you're talking about. It could be multiplication, but not growth of the entity. So the multiplication might be chopping it up into pieces and then throwing it in other places per se,
And it could be that it's the same thing that happened to Jesus, where he said, "Eat my body and drink my blood," and then everyone leaves apart from the 12. It's like Jesus had this most amazing following, and he's like, "Screw that. I'm going to tell you what you actually have to do to inherit eternal life." And everyone walks apart from the people that have got nothing else to go back to. And I'm like,
sure.
There is something. And so one of the really interesting things for me about how we do church in the West, if we go back to the hyperfixation on the individual, what's interesting is that there is a desire in all of humanity to be part and belong to something, right? We know that. That's really obvious. But with the hyperfixation of the individualism, particularly on the basis of right-wing politics, we see the left goes super hardcore towards groupthink and towards being grouped into a group identity, which is actually a response to the in my view, the hyper-individualized nature of what it is to be an individual in the context of the Western culture. But if you take that into church, for example, what happens is that the pastor of the church has in his mind what success is. And what happens is that sometimes the success measures have to change depending on the season that you're in. But for example, if your success measure is growth and numerical value, then what you'll prioritize will be what brings numerical value. Families never grow quickly, because there's a 9-month gestation period of each child. Then you have to have at least 2 years before you have another one, because you're so screwed up in your brain from that kid keeping up at night and like all the rest of it. And what happens is if you prioritize family in church, growth goes so slowly. And for a CEO type pastor, and for the person that has growth and mega church in their mind, like the bigger the church is, the more successful it is, family cannot function as part of the leadership model, and it cannot function as part of the core culture because it is too slow. And that is the exact representation of the industrialization model of the Western world in the last 150, 200 years. Because what we're saying is, we are saying above and beyond family and what success looks like in family, which by the way is the primary call of the church, So what we're going to do is that we are going to model our church on the basis of something that is anti-family. And then it becomes something that looks far more like a business, producing something that people willingly give their time and money to, as opposed to want to join because there's community involved. And I think that that's a really interesting place to be in the Western society, Western church that we have. And I don't think there's longevity in it, because I think that there are more and more and more people who are like, man, this 20 years of me emotionally encountering God, it didn't change my life. But what changed my life is that 75-year-old grey-haired man that for 2 years basically told me to sort my life out, and I did, and now I'm better. And there's this really interesting narrative around that.
Yeah. Well, it's a fairly new like phenomenon, like the kind of mega church thing is like really like since the 60s, maybe 70s, maybe, of like that kind of model. And sometimes you need a generation to figure out stupid ideas. I mean, when Israel was like moving out, they had to let an entire generation of people die in that adaptation phase of the desert before they could move on to more promises of God. So I think that maybe that's it. I see like what I see people most desperate for now in our age bracket is community. Like that's the thing that they're most desperate for, because, and you know, a lot of people have left where they're from. Some people like still live in the same place, but a lot of people have uprooted to go for jobs or university. Then they up meeting somebody there and staying there. And so someone has compromised of like, I've left my mother and father. So now we're here in this other place. And so that's partially what the church facilitates in a practical way and in a spiritual way, is that, and James, he's like, take care of like widows and orphans. And so it's like, how do you take care of a widow or orphan? Will you be kids to her, or you be in essence a husband to her, a spouse to her, in the sense of helping meet needs, you know, emotionally, physically, or not physically, but you know what I mean, like food and water and stuff. Okay. Yeah. But
I'm going to take care of that widow's needs physically.
So being in that, because this is one of the things that I you know.
Sorry, Dylan, I completely threw you, my man.
You're good. I don't want to go off in like a rabbit trail about this, 'cause I think I brought this up to you before, but my observation is in Europe, because of the Second World War, people are very skeptical of other people outside their circle. And if people act too friendly, or it's viewed as invasive, it's viewed as like, oh, like you're trying to solicit me something or whatever. And so my observation is like, being in the church, it's like we're going to meet at the church, and this is where it starts and stops with us. Like we have our blood family, like we're good. And in America, I see like people who are like orphans, like kind of yearning for family in a sense, and they're open to that. And people who have like small kids or in our age group and kind of stage of life, but you have people who are our parents' age who are like, hey, we're retired and we want to enjoy our retirement. We want to like bounce around. We want to do whatever. And then people who are young adults who don't have those responsibilities yet are now like, I don't know what the hell kids are doing now. Like, I mean, in the same year, I don't want to go off a rant, but last year, 2024, more middle-class people visited food banks in America historically than ever before, but more Americans took holidays to Europe than ever before in the same year. Those two statistics were happening together. And so there is a disconnect of like, to your point, of like things are being commoditized and wealth is being distributed and things are being built, stuff is happening, but then there's people who are like falling below the gap. And when the food banks, what they reported was, these are not people who are generationally impoverished. These are people who said, we literally just can't, like there's an extra $50 we need at the grocery store, so we're supplementing from the food bank. Like we're going to buy groceries still, but we're supplementing. So whose job is that? Who are these? Who are your people? Like whatever. And so it's this weird thing, to your point, we've hyper fixated on what we can package in this institution, this brand. Well, I can create digital products, music, things like that, package them, sell them. But like, and you know, not to shoot ourselves in the foot, we're sitting here doing a podcast. Could I be like going and visiting somebody in my church? Could I be, we're part of the problem, Tim.
We're all part of the problem. That's why
yeah. But it's like, I guess like in the same way, there's a conversation that's happening now. What comes after free trade or capitalism? Like, it's a serious conversation among economists. Like, what's next? I guess that would be like the real question. I know our Catholic and Orthodox brothers are going to say, we already have the answer for you. You guys went astray, come back. But I mean, realistically, like in terms of like, you know, kind of free churches or Protestant churches, like we kind of walked through like some stages. What do you perceive is coming around the bend?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think for me, I think there'll be more. Francis Chan did this, didn't he? He had a massive church that was like, "This is stupid. Like, what are we doing? Like, let's split this down."
He said it was stupid. They didn't. They were sad.
They were really sad. Yeah, because they loved it, because they got their emotional, physical, like whatever needs met. One of the things about church growth is that it's generally among Generation Z, some Generation Alpha, Generation Z, Generation Z, and like you said, what they want most is community. Now, what's really interesting with that for me is that they have a full sense of community from their digital footprint, from their avatar online. And so what we're going to have to do is, as the church, we're going to have to unplug. I think we're going to have to unplug from the digital world and begin to do analog relationships again. That's what I think we're going to have to do. So instead of it being, come to my church, come to this central hub, big churches, we don't do anything out, everyone comes to us. It turns into, we actually end up going into homes and houses and having meals together, eating. Do you know so I had a friend, and he said, we go to a big church. We don't have any community. We are going to do once a month a community where we're going to go through a John Mark Comer podcast, and we're going to eat together and have all the kids in the same room at the same time and see if we can do family like that. So once a month, Jess and I and our 3 kids and like another 8 kids and 3 other couples meet together to do intentional community outside of church, because in church we can't find community outside of team. So what's really interesting in the church at the moment is that the way you find your community is on a team, and the main teams, production, media, worship, all of that kid stuff, all that stuff. And what happens is that the young tend to gravitate towards anything with a camera or digital device, and because they have all the time in the world, they spend all their time together in the church. But for anybody with children, they don't have much community. And it's very hard to build community in church because of the nature of how we run church. You walk in, your kids go somewhere else, and you walk in, you worship. If your kid needs a nappy change, you get buzzed and you go out of worship, or they cry, you got to go out of worship. And then you hear a talk for 25 minutes that's very low level, not in depth at all, because you want to make sure that all the non-Christians understand.
You're not talking about my preaching, Tim.
Not yours, Michael. No, nor mine. But I'm saying, like, we're like we have this, like, we got to make sure non-Christians understand it, and so you walk out as an experienced believer, absolutely pumped that people gave their life to Jesus, but absolutely undiscipled, right? And so then you're like, okay, so how do I get discipled? So you create your own thing, and that is where we're going. We're going to communities being built by individuals or family groups with other families, with other people in probably similar life stage, and building those things within the context of larger churches. I think larger churches will stay. I don't think they're going to be all Francis Chans and go into like 50 people groups in various different aspects of the city. But I think that large churches are going to stay, but I think there will be a fragmentation of where people find their community into smaller groups, because I don't think you can do it in a big church. It's absolutely impossible. Because the plan for big churches to do big families, to have more teams, to have more people commoditized, to come into the church centrally and to do things for more people at once. So, for example, instead of doing marriage prep 1-to-1, What we're doing is we're doing marriage prep for 8 or 9 different couples in the building at one time. And I'm like, okay, cool. But that's called big church mindset. That's what it's called, right? And I'm like, all right, but what if that's not a good thing? What if 9 couples in a room doesn't work? And because they don't know each other, they won't be as open, they won't be as honest, they won't actually work through the things that they need to work through in order to have a healthy marriage. Like, at what point does that big church mindset actually begin minimizing the individual person who's actually going to walk into a marriage and actually not have any idea about, like, probably needs to need to share a bank account or whatever. And I think, like, there's bits where people are going to turn around and go, actually, I don't think that's true or real. And so they'll end up going to church on a Sunday because they love the idea of salvation and they want to invest in that idea. They want to invest in the idea that the church is for everybody and that the church is growing, and they love the product. They love the worship. They get an amazing sense of God's presence and community or whatever in the worship, communion with God in the worship, but community will lack. Unless you are under 25 and not married. Community, you will not have a community met in that context. Now, what's really interesting is that the other option you have is going to a church with the most awful singing, the most, like, cat squealing vocals, and, like, the guy that played the piano and literally can't play it, and you sacrifice that part of it for the family. Because those churches will have family community orientation. They'll do loads of stuff after the meeting. They'll do loads of stuff during the week. They'll have one service on a Sunday, not 6-7 million, you know. And so what will happen is that you end up sacrificing something. But for churches like ours, what I think will happen is that people will continue with the model of the church. There'll be a bum and a seat. There'll be the 10% in the offering. They'll keep the church going, but they won't find community there, because the only way you can find community if you're busy is if you do it intentionally. The only way that you can find community in the church, big churches, is by being busy in the church. And if you've got a family and a full-time job, you can't do that. So actually you have to end up trying to make yourself a community, and I think that's where we're going to go.
Yeah, it's interesting because me and you, like, the church that you're a part of is more on the, it's quite bigger church. Like, it's at 1,200 people coming, and my church is a bit smaller. It's only about, I think maybe you have like 60, 70-ish people there on a Sunday, maybe 120 total. And while we don't have the cat scratching like vocals like you described, but it is like more of a communal focus. But I think like the thing that I'm realizing as I get older, just how much I value like friends, because as I've gotten older, like just more and more and more people die in my life, and you realize like mortality is a real thing. And so when you find a good friend, like just the value level of it goes up way higher. Not that I didn't value people before. It's just like my awareness of the worth of it. And then also like somehow I want my kids to experience people, not in the same way that I experience them, but like being around the guy who mentored me, and like letting my kid, like watching him and his wife, like interact with my kids and so on. But I think like the integration of each other's life to do it together, I can't overstate the value that I feel and see for that. And I feel like people make every excuse in the world not to pursue it. And it's like, that's probably one of the most disheartening things for me. Like, it's really painful for me if like my wife loves to host people. Hospitality is her gift, and she's so fantastic at it. And so we just try to think of the lowest lift way of like, everybody has to eat dinner. Let's just have people over for dinner or lunch. And so you're just always doing this tightrope walk of like, yeah, but my kid takes a nap at this time, and we were always like kind of loose with that of like, if our kid's going to take a nap, we just throw him in the stroller so that we can go wherever. But everyone has these really like crazy specific routines. And I was around this Swiss couple, they were missionaries, and they had 4 kids, and the age of the kids was quite spread out. I mean, they had a kid in his like mid-20s, and they had like a kid that wasn't even 10 yet. And I was like, how's this work with your kids? Because you guys have lived in like several different countries. He's like, well, what we found is this whole illusion that kids have to have this very specific routine and whatever. That does create structure, creates repetition, but you can create that structure by, the structure is we're a family, and wherever we're going, we're doing stuff together. And so in the commoditization, again, like just not to keep banging on that drum, it's like factory, everything is structured towards the commoditization. Even education, sit here for 8 hours, be quiet, absorb information, regurgitate it back. That's not learning, that's memorization. It's not learning, it's not wisdom. And then so we see like this building towards that. In reality, relationships super inconvenient, they're sacrifice. Sometimes these people suck and you still have to make the choice of being around them. Sometimes they sing horribly. No offense to whoever hears this, I have a recording of my wedding. And one of the guys in my revival group, he was by the camera, and so all you hear is him singing the whole time. And it's awful. It's awful. You can't even really listen. Like, the worship was awesome, but it was awful. But that's family. Not that you have to give that guy the mic, but it just so happened he's by camera. But so that's the one thing, if anybody takes anything away from this episode, is that, man, like, if people are inviting you into their home, if they're trying to make space for you and make time, you have to try to make that work. You have to sacrifice for that and do it, and like, be realistic. But it's like, if I have the option to like be around you and Jess and have my kids like be exposed to you and like your wisdom and your love and your energy and your focus and your questions, like, you're going to do things I would never do. You're going to say things I would never say. And so that just like slingshots their progression. It also like cements in like core value. It's just so invaluable to have that and to prioritize that. And then also just to enjoy each other. We're freaking gonna live. We live forever. We're eternal beings. We're what, this thing is kind of about. And so we were gifted to each other. Christ was gifted to us. Like, the Father gifts Christ to the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit gifts Christ to the Father, and so on. And we're part of that. And we're gifted to each other. We're supposed to be reconciled to each other. And we're so damn busy trying to make more money, trying to coach sports, trying to do that, which is not bad things, but it's just about prioritization. And I feel like,
because actually those things are created by human beings as a cultic expression of the divine. So wherever human beings create culture, there is a divine spark there somewhere. Wherever you are, whatever you do, there is a divine spark there. The issue is it orientated towards the correct structure of prioritization, or is it orientated towards selfishness? Is it orientated towards mammon? Is it orientated towards controlling your children? Even in terms of they have to have the 15-minute nap at 1:23 and 42 seconds. Like, where is it orientated to? Because actually, if we can orientate individualism to the community, then what you have is you have family. So every family is made up of an individual, and every family is made up of an individual that thinks individually, but they sacrifice their ability or their freedom to speak their mind over and over again on the basis that they are part of a structure of a family where they prefer the other. And I mean, that's the ultimate example of that is obviously marriage. But one of the foundational things for me is that we say, you and I, we would say, you know what, like, if one of us really needed each other, we'd probably get on a plane and come and see each other. Like, we live, I don't know, like, how many hours away from each other, how many miles away from each other, but actually, like, there's if you said, hey, I need you, then I'd be like, hey, babe, I've got to go, should we all go? Or is it just me? I'm like,
I thought you were going to say, hey, babe, I'll be there. Sorry.
Yeah, hey, babe, I'll be there. I'm with the mints. But actually, like, there's just this really interesting dynamic of friendship, because actually true friendship is family. Because true friendship is me saying to you, hey, you know, like, when you treat your kid like that, it really impacts my kid like that. And because we spend so much time together, can you please not do that? And what family does, it grows health, because it grows communication. But if you don't have family, you never learn how to communicate. You never learn how to talk. You never learn how to adopt or absorb someone else's point of view. And even if you disagree with it well. I mean, all of my lesson growing up was how not to be a twat. That was my family lesson, because basically it was like, I annoyed people for 25 years of my life. I really, really annoyed people. And I was like, why am I so annoying to people? And then I realized that the common denominator is the fact that I just say what I think all the time. And I mean, to an extent, that's a gift, but to an extent, it's a major deterioration of relationship if I can't shut my mouth. And so actually, we have to be aware of that. And you don't ever learn that in a business. or in a structure like a church that is structured on a business. Because what you learn about that is that if you are higher up, you get to say what you want. In fact, if you're higher up in that business or organization, it's made for you and designed around you in order that you can actually speak about what you want. So, for example, you can say what you want and say, I was just having a bad day. It is what it is. Or you can say what you want in a business or a business organization, and you could be like, well, like this is my business, I run it, like it or lump it, and that's actually true, but that's not the church. The church is slow, painful, iron sharpens iron relationships that grow health, not numbers necessarily. Although hopefully at some point numbers will grow. And so I think, like, for me, we need to address that as part of what our success measures are in the Western church.
It's good, dude. It's a good place to stop. I have a meeting coming up, and so I think we'll pick up there because we went deep in the weeds. We have a lot of stuff to unpack, but love you, buddy. Thanks so much for sharing. Sorry to stop the flow.
Oh, no,
I'm going to jump in the next one.
And say hi to the fam. I'll say hi to Mike.
Yep. Love you, buddy.
Peace. Bye.
Will. That's all, folks. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Rebuilding community and taking responsibility, living a life rooted in truth, that doesn't happen by accident. It demands vigilance, it demands courage, and it demands that we all play our little part, no matter how small that might be. And if there's one thing we need to remember, it's this: that life was not meant to be lived alone. Meaning is not found in self-indulgence, but in service to God and to others, to something beyond ourselves. And if you look at the creation story, there's a series of benedictions where God creates light, and he creates the heavens and the earth and the animals, and he separates them. It just says, and he said it was good, and he said it was good, and he said it was good. And then after all these benedictions comes a curse, and he says, and God created man and said, it is not good for man to be alone. It is not good for man to be alone. So if this conversation challenged you and encouraged you or made you think more seriously about your own space in the world, share it. Share it with someone who you think might need to hear it, and leave a review. For me, it's not about growing numbers, but in a marketing background, I understand that the algorithm is getting fed information, and algorithms are what drive these platforms, and they need to be trained. And so to show some meaningful content to people who actually need it and who are actually going to engage with it, that is done through you liking and sharing it. So leave a review and share it. Put a rating on it. It helps plant seeds that will take root and get in front of other people. Thank you for listening with us today. Carry the weight and build something worthy of the gift you've been given. Until next time, toodaloo.